Hello, and welcome to the Media Roundtable Industry Edition. If you've been keeping up with us, we've spent the last few years talking to leading voices in podcast about what they create, why they create it, and the impact they want it to have on the world. This is a true roundtable format, and like we say in the name, this is our Industry Edition. So it's going to be less focused on creators and more about how media and audio industry experts can adapt to the news of the day. I'm your host, Jennifer Laine, Head of Marketing and Special Projects at Oxford Road. And once again, I'm joined by Dan Granger, founder and CEO of Oxford Road, Alyssa Meyers, journalist at Marketing Brew, Bryan Barletta, founder and partner at Sounds Profitable, and James Cridland, founder and editor of Podnews. As you may remember from last week, this is the second half, or part two, of our series looking back at what shaped the podcast industry in 2022 and ahead at what we think may play out in 2023. Last week, we solved the challenge of how to define a podcast, reflected on the rise of subscription, and spent the final 45 minutes of the episode taking a deep dive into data transparency, validation, and bias. We made some friends, we definitely made some enemies, and now we're back for part two.
Okay, we're looking at 2023. I have a few ideas of what I think might happen, and I don't know if this is just a wish list, but I'm going to throw out what the topic is and give you like a couple sentences of context, and you guys are just going to give your feedback about what you think. So even though they knew that, just nothing is working as well for many of them because consumers are spending less on ordering subscriptions and things to show up at their houses, like when they were all forced to stay inside all the time. So I think we're getting a boomerang effect on everybody that was up is now down, and some that were down are actually climbing up a little bit better. But so that's why I just think it's gonna shift. And then I think the other piece for you to comment on, James, was I'm predicting that we start to see a rise in a remnant marketplace in podcast where you have DRTV, where there's a specific infrastructure around remnant. We have it in radio. We haven't really seen that in podcast. And Oxford Road may or may not be participating in bringing this into being, but I think that it's going to be a larger trend. And I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I think remnant is interesting. Remnant advertising, of course, you need it for radio, you need it for TV because you need to fill the ad breaks. And you know, I'm a little bit bored here of watching TV channels where you see the same ad. In fact, I saw the same ad 5 times in one ad break a couple of days ago, which was
which podcast were you listening to?
No, this was a TV channel.
I'm messing with you, but you know we're starting to see the same thing.
But yeah, and I think you know when you look at podcasts, there isn't necessarily that requirement to fill space. There isn't the requirement that you've got a 4-minute ad break, you've got to fill it. That's where remnants historically have come from. And I think from my point of view, I've seen the erosion in spot prices for radio, for broadcast radio. That's where I used to work. And the amount of money that you would pay for a 30-second ad now is lower than the amount that you paid in you know, just in normal money, not even looking at inflation. The amount of money that you would pay for a spot now is the same as 20 years ago. You know, there's been no attempt by that industry to keep their yield up, to make sure that spot prices continue to increase. And my worry around remnant advertising, particularly remnant advertising in podcasts where there's no need for filling that ad break, is what happens to the spot price. Does the spot price come down? And how do we reverse out of that as a business if that actually happens? It's something that radio really messed up on in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and I think it's a lesson that we can hopefully learn, and I'm sure a lesson that you'll be working on.
Indeed. We intend to teach.
I'm glad.
I think in 2023, we are ready to move into the age of verification. And what that means is it used to be direct response brands would run ads. It didn't really matter how many impressions or downloads they got because they're looking at the results. They're looking at the response. But now you've got big companies running a lot of units in a show. They might be running a spot break with multiple units in a row. You have big brands starting to come in and dynamically insert, and there's ad stacking. There's download promises that don't actually get realized. There is question about whether or not you can even verify what happened. There's a question of where did we land in the show, and was it the same show as our competitors? So there's been a real lack of standardized verification, and I propose that next year people are really going to start to care about that. Bryan, what do you think?
I think you're spot on. I think we saw it happen this year too. I think it's been a really big improvement, right? Because we're not at the point yet where people are using third parties to double check like the impressions in the billable. There's aspects of that get a little bit messy, and it hasn't been something we've adopted. But what is a downloaded episode that included your ads sound like? I think what's really interesting is today we found people violating a general understanding of what should and shouldn't be happening. Something as simple as brushing off a call to action and assuming that it's okay if it was close enough and the buyer not being happy with it, all the way to 4 ads being in the same episode without buyer approval. I think the next evolution of this is now we have the tools to make sure that things are held accountable. What we need to do is have a manifesto, and I'd love to actually work with you on this, is what is a podcast, right? Like what is a podcast? What is buying a podcast ad like, right? How many breaks in how long of an episode? How many ads per break? How many advertisers per episode, right? All of these different things, because when a buyer who's savvy about this says, awesome, I'm very happy to be in the mid-roll. I don't want to be more than the second break or the second spot in a break. And this is how all that works, then you can check that. But if all of a sudden you just say, yes, I would like to buy a mid-roll, and then you're ad 5 of 5 in their 7th mid-roll, well, you didn't ask for it. I mean, verification shows you where you are and you might not buy them again, but there's no contract or agreement. You just bought a mid-roll. You didn't ask the right question. So I think we've found that we're all not playing with the same deck of cards. We're all not playing with the same agreement of what a podcast ad format is. And I think that the next step for this is defining that structure, putting it into contract, and verification becomes guardrails instead of like a parachute.
So you're saying that the podcast industry is rigged?
I'm not even remotely saying it.
You heard it here first.
Oh gosh,
Bryan Barletta is on the record.
He did say that is what I heard. Okay,
I'm saying that every publisher comes to the table with different set of expectations, and they assume that it's on the buyer to ask those questions. And I think what we need to say is here's the default. Where do you vary? Right. So that a publisher can say, I don't follow the default template. Here's what it is. Would you still like to work together? So that a buyer can have a preconceived set of notions instead of just hoping for the best.
Well, and here's another question for you about this, Bryan, because I know you're doing a lot of work on pixel tracking. I wonder if you think looking forward at 2023, will there be new rules on when pixels fire and how often they fire during an ad, and how we can measure impressions against that?
No, we talked about it earlier that there was no solid impressions. There are, right? It's a file download. It's like downloading something from Dropbox. It's pretty secure. It is hard to defraud it if we look at things and actually break things down on what does and doesn't count, right? But the problem is that we keep challenging it. I don't think we're going to see improvements to how we fire pixels or how we count downloads or impressions until the apps themselves send us data. And the truth is I'm not expecting one-to-one data from the apps. I'm not expecting Apple Podcasts to fire a Podsights pixel from my device when I listen to a podcast. I am expecting more listener data to be in there, more things to be modeled against the total. It'll be interesting, but I don't think we're going to get to a point where the metrics truly change that much. And I'd like us all to buy into it. But how we determine what is an ad buy, what is a mid roll, how long an episode, how long a podcast should be, how many ads in a podcast of X length, how many ads per break. Those are all the things that we haven't defined that we really need to.
Yeah, and you couldn't be more right. And Alyssa, I know you've done about 60 interviews on this topic for Marketing Brew. Do you have any key findings to share or thoughts on 2023?
Yeah, the verification thing, if there's one thing that I would be willing to bet on, is that it will be the age of verification, and not only as a, point of desire for brands and agencies, but something that the industry needs to do, is almost at a vital tipping point right now with everything that happened this year with the Podsights acquisition, with the certain company who we are not naming having an issue with impressions. That sort of thing happens at a really big company, and it's top of mind for people. If that's the first thing they hear about podcasting, or the big thing they hear, they start to question how verification works in this industry.
Yeah.
I have heard from brands that are big podcast advertising brands, they do survey attribution. It's a lot of survey but I've heard from some brands, okay, we tried pixel attribution for podcasting 2 years ago and it didn't work out so well. We were getting some information and some data that these companies were, trying to sell us, and we weren't really seeing the results. We didn't think it worked out super well. That's only going to happen. And I say to those brands, well, that was a couple of years ago. Things are a lot different now. It's only gonna have so many chances at that sort of thing, we're at a point where this year I think podcasting really needs to prove to these brands that tried pixel attribution 2 years ago, or have only heard sort of the verification scandals in podcasting. We really need to prove that this stuff is here and it works.
So that you bring up a really important point. Sometimes I think we have to experience a certain amount of pain before we're willing to, get off the couch and actually make change. Do you feel like we have to have some sort of larger scandal or fraud event or accusation of fraud before our industry says, yeah, we're going to get serious about this?
I think we need to. Hopefully not, right?
Well, but are we making progress without it?
I think that the people that could just swim through this are the people that have enough on their plate, right? When somebody comes to you and says and I'll just name them, the iHeart Subway Surfers thing sucked, right? It caused massive damage. And then we have the issue with Samsung overcalling the downloads, right? But we were able to identify it, and we were able to rule those out and remove those impressions. And that's fine, right? It happened. We can move past it. But when a buyer comes to you and says, I'm cautious, podcasting is super interesting, but I'm very cautious because here are 2 news articles that I read in Marketing Brew about where things get weird in podcasting. A good seller can say, hey, awesome. We don't buy on those sources. We don't track that data. Anything that's unknown, we don't worry about. Here is the template that we buy in. We only buy in shows with, maximum of 6 ad breaks, maximum of 3 ads, maximum 2 minutes per break, maximum 3 advertisers, whatever the case may be. And they confidently say, with us, that's not a problem. But that with us is unique to every agency, is unique to every publisher. And then you have the alternatively there, the salesperson who goes, I can give you a 50% discount on CPM. And the problem is that today that buyer says yes to either one of those. We're not losing a lot of buyers, because they look at that and they say, that's leverage, right? Some buyers have left, but I think a lot of times the buyers look at that and say, that's leverage. That's leverage for a lower CPM. That's leverage for a better relationship. That's leverage to move away from a contract we didn't like. I think that works there. But unifying that, what we really need to do is say, this is the answer. We all get behind it. No more of this bullshit that your proprietary method of counting downloads or your strategy is better than anybody else on what is and isn't valid. No, you're the whipped cream and the cherry on top. Fantastic. We need the same language. And that's what we've been working on with Sounds Profitable. And I love what Marketing Brew is doing, especially Alyssa. We're trying to reiterate these points. We all need to have the same defensible points. We all need to have some standards. Marty Michaels from Gumball is my favorite quote. He said, there's no banner ad in podcasting. I know what it's like to go to a website. I know what ads look like on a website. I know what I don't like from ads from a website. And I know what I do. I don't listen to a lot of new podcasts. I listen to the same podcasts I like. So I know their format. I know which ones I tolerate because I stop listening to the ones I don't tolerate. So when we're selling podcast ads to these people, they only know what they've experienced, and podcast isn't a norm for them yet. So when they find out they're on a show that's 7 hours long with 52 ad breaks and 7 ads per break, they were like, I didn't think that was a real thing. Why would that
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And we've seen our cousins in display get hammered on this sort of thing.
Yeah.
Right. And what is the watershed event that once somebody calls this out, because it's a real thorn in the side of the industry, at what point does it actually have a massive impact on the revenue of the industry? And do we have to make serious correction?
I don't know if we're in that place yet to have a watershed moment, because I think for that, you need to have rules that are being broken. And I think what we saw with iHeart and Subway Surfers was a general kind of ick, like a bad taste in our mouth, but nothing illegal. Like there's not, and maybe Matt can speak to this actually from the IAB's point of view. Obviously, the IAB is doing some work in podcasting, but other regulatory agencies, the FTC has seemingly nothing to do with podcasting. I asked them a few months ago, do you have any sort of rules for political ads on podcasts like you do for radio? No, nothing to do with podcasting. So it's hard to have, I think, a big watershed moment or a big scandal when the rules are just kind of like not set in stone. There are things that we feel a little bad about, but it's hard to say, okay, as an industry, we're putting our foot down because this is breaking this rule. We don't have a lot of rules like FTC regulations in podcasting yet.
I think that, at Adweek, actually, there was a presentation by someone who on display showed that they got on in a 1 hour period, 10,000 impressions, right? We can dig up the article for the notes, but on one website, they were just hammered with the same ad. It just had a massive refresh rate. These are not unique problems to podcasting. They're just incredibly offensive when they're in your ears in your private space, right? And it's such a small community. The first thing to remember is it's not unique. We are retreading the same things that we've done in digital and video and all these, even radio to some degree. But I think the second thing is, I think it did hurt some people. I think that after the iHeart thing, brands negotiated, we're heading towards a recession. People are afraid about these things. Brands negotiated harder than ever. I mean, it was the week of Thanksgiving, and I had people still trying to sell Thanksgiving impressions that I was dealing with. I know we're recording on December 12th right now. There are still people hungry to sell Q4. It has been a little bit harder this year, and it will be a little bit harder next year. And these brands, these buyers, have the tools to say that they do and don't want to buy in certain places, to insist on stricter targeting, to request lower CPMs, a request for verification to be included in costs. There's the toll being taken, but podcasting is still hot enough that we're still seeing that trend. We're not at a point where we've hit 100% sell through and we're starting to squeeze for margin. Once we get there, if this happened at that point when we were selling out, if this happened the beginning of 2022 where it felt like publishers were on fire and could do no wrong, it would have taken the air out of their balloon faster than this potential recession. It would have immediately deflated that uphill doubling of prices we saw at the beginning of the year.
Well, okay, so to put a button on this one, we saw
these quick hits, right?
These quick hits, yeah. So first and foremost, I told you guys I was going to throw out a topic and you were going to give me a quick soundbite. That was a lie by me, and then you guys participated in the lie. So we've got some misinformation to deal with. We're going to take a quick 20-minute commercial break, and we'll come back and unpack more of this later.
Only one advertiser, though.
But
it's one advertiser and 10 commercials.
10 commercials for one client. Yeah, that's what we plan to do. They love that when we do that. The listener experience is bananas. So what I wanted to say is, look at the beginning of the year. I think in Q1, before Ukraine took over the news, everything was Joe Rogan all the time.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, brand safety and suitability is a topic, and people besides us are making a big issue out of this. Everybody got on board. It took a big public problem. And what I'm forecasting, I don't know if it'll be 2023, but I'm saying that I think some of the bad habits that we have and the lack of accountability, there's going to be a tipping point. There's going to be a straw that breaks the camel's back. And when it starts to impact revenue across the industry and undermine our growth, then all of a sudden things get standardized so that the charter that we're putting together, the Port Huron statement or whatever that Bryan's going to draft and we're going to participate in and all sign, I think that's necessary, but I think it's going to require people to start losing money in visible ways before everybody starts adopting and adhering to that. So no time like the present to lay that stuff out, right?
I agree with you, and I'm excited for that. I mean, the IAB had their audio leadership gathering, and I got up there and I said, in the near future, brands need to stop buying unknown inventory. And if we don't get our shit together on how to identify the player that these podcasts are in, or the referring URL for the website that the podcast is in, and invalidating them if we can't trust them, if we can't make second-class inventory, then buyers should say, I only want to buy impressions that are in Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or Google apps. And if the publisher says we can't do that, then they move to programmatic, where they can do that in programmatic audio because the buyer has all the signals. You might lose the host endorsement, but you maintain all of that control. And then you have to figure out on the sliding scale what is and isn't more important to you. But you mentioned brand safety and suitability. Why I'm a big proponent on visibility and all of that. And I think two interesting things. One, I think it's a negotiating tool. I think that brands benefit by saying, what is your strategy on it? Because again, there's two answers. Here is our strategy. And the other one is, I'll
give you a discount.
How's 50% off, right? Like and a buyer is motivated to negotiate in their best interest, which is they pay as little as possible. Good on them. But I think that the killer part about brand safety and suitability, and I will admit my bias on this, I'm consistently finding content that I would not, like I personally am not going to listen to it, but content that I would have thrown away with things that I thought were more radical or more offensive just because of how they label themselves or some of their descriptions. But when run through tools like Barometer and other things, I find that they're no different than some of the stuff I do listen to. And I think that that's the key thing here. Like we just did that study, Safe and Sound, which was a blast to dig into it about who is offended and where you're offended and what offends you. And podcasting is tune in. You're not 30 minutes into Joe Rogan and going, what am I listening to? Like you chose it. So I think that's going to be such an interesting thing to explore. I think we're going to open up where brands, the difference, Disney, we had a chance to talk with the team at Disney, the difference between flipping through the channels and landing on 2020 and seeing and then they were murdered. And now to the Applebee's commercial, like that, devastating, right? Nobody opted into it. You caught the tail end of it right in the ad. The 2020 podcast, nobody's been like, I wonder what this is, So when the ad flies there, it's way safer because the person opted in.
All right, so tell me if you've ever heard of any of these companies. Indeed, Shopify, NetSuite, Headspace, Quip, Theragun, Postmates. I'm not only the host of the Media Roundtable, but also CEO of a company called Oxford Road, and we are the world's leading independently owned and operated audio ad agency. And what that means is that we help great companies, many that you have probably heard of on some of the other podcasts that you listen to. We help them test and scale campaigns in audio channels, with podcast being one of those leading channels. Some of the work that we do includes media planning and buying, as well as analytics, attribution, and insights. And we also have a very special way that we deal with creative and copy generation. We have our own proprietary process called Audiolytics that allows us to score ads for their persuasiveness. If you're looking to be involved in audio and you want a partner that can help work with you to make sure that you achieve unprecedented ROI and massive scale, you should get in touch with us at Oxford Road. And by the way, the only reason that we're able to do the work of the Media Roundtable is because we have a great team at Oxford Road that supports us and makes it possible. So, what we're doing is not just a podcast, but we're really trying to help brands live out their values and balance that with their business objectives, which is an increasingly hard thing to do in this world of misinformation and malice that's infecting so much of our media. But at Oxford Road, we don't want to just broker this stuff. We want to impact the industry for good. We want to raise the bar on what gets created. And Oxford Road is helping make that possible through the Media Roundtable. So if you're somebody that's interested in working with an ad agency or a partner on this type of work for your advertising campaigns, go to oxfordroad.com. It's easy to spell. And get in touch with us, or at least just sign up for our free newsletter, The Influencer. That's oxfordroad.com. Amen. And that was a big part of our thinking from the beginning with working with groups like Adfontes and Barometer, is that we just want people not to throw the baby out with the bathwater and be able to make a more informed decision, whether they're a consumer or a brand. So, James, my next prediction is that in 2023, the direct-to-consumer brands And by the way, this is exactly counter to the article that Ashley Carman just published, which I had a quote in, which was to say DDC to the rescue in 2023. But I think that actually, even though the industry has been dependent on them for so long, I think D2C brands are challenged this year because we're kind of seeing this COVID whiplash. And they're really struggling. So I actually think they're going to be pulling back from podcasts, and more brand advertisers are going to come in because of the tools that have been advertised, whether or not those tools are real, whether or not programmatic is ready for prime time. I don't know that that's stopping brands from engaging early. And so I think that the share of brand to D2C is going to increase as D2C decreases. What's your hot take on that one?
I mean, my hot take is I would certainly agree that we are seeing, I mean, nobody wants to use the R word, but, in most countries in the world, we are pretty well in recession, even if we've not actually publicly admitted
that, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that
we're comfortable with that language here.
Yeah, and I think from that point of view, clearly there is going to be an awful lot of change to who advertises and what they advertise. And I think we need to be cognizant of that and understand that things are going to be very different. I mean, just in the conference space, I noticed that Spotify has been told, according to a Swedish paper, Spotify has been told you are not going to any conferences next year at all, and there will be no non-essential travel. I'm sure that we'll still see the odd Spotify person in a conference, but that tells you something, in terms of changing habits in this particular industry. And I'm sure that we will see changes in terms of the overall ad revenue, but also the ad mix as we move forward.
Or it's because Spotify purchased all the conferences, and so why go there when you already own the whole room?
Well, I guess also a different take on this, with the different brand safety and suitability tools coming into the space, making it a little bit safer for blue chip companies to come into podcasts still being a very efficient channel. Do you think that will also play into sort of the downturn of DTC in podcast, or do you think it really is just sort of recessionary driven?
I mean, I think when you look at I think when you look at economy and difficulties in the economy, one of the first things to go, as we all know, is the ad budget. It gets shaved an awful lot, or it gets really focused into the ads that the brand knows works really, really well. And I think we should, make sure that podcasting is there as one of those fallback ad platforms that they know works, that they've got the data from, trustworthy data from, that they can actually then continue to use in their mix. And there may be other things that fall by the wayside. And I think that's a really important thing that we should all be focusing on.
Let's move on, shall we? What I do want to ask you about before we wrap up is values getting devalued. One of my predictions here is that we've had a good run for the last few years where brands and programs, creators and networks have made a lot of public statements about their commitments to values-driven initiatives, DEI being a great example of that. My prediction is that you're actually going to see a softening of those standards. And as you're seeing layoffs happen across the industry, some of the things that were driven by purpose that they weren't able to build into their business model in a sustainable way, a lot of that stuff that was more surface level is going to go by the wayside. What do you guys think? Alyssa, let's start with you because you've been very patient with Bryan. Let's be honest. You should have a mute.
It's my whole job. I love my favorite part of the day is when I call Bryan and he just talks to me for 30 minutes.
Bryan?
Yeah.
I don't even breathe. Just oxygen straight there.
No, I agreed with you wholeheartedly on your force prediction there. This one, I don't know. I might have to go ahead and play devil's advocate and disagree. And it almost feels like the opposite of devil's advocate, actually, because I'm going to be a relentless optimist about it, which is sometimes not the best quality in a reporter, as my editor will tell you. She's always like, do you seriously believe this? I'm like, yeah, someone said it to me. And she's like, people will lie to you, but no, I mean, I think that, you're right that things will have to get deprioritized for the case of cost cutting. Like my own company saw layoffs recently. It's been in the news a ton with brands and media companies. Talk of a recession is not going anywhere. People are still talking about cutting ad spend and all that stuff. I think it might be harder than it was in the past, though, for companies that have prioritized topics like DE&I and climate change to the point where they're putting this front and center for the past year or 2 years. They've kind of made noise, made a big deal, like, hey, we're really invested in, upping representation of people of color in our C-suite, or we are going to spend the money to make our products more sustainable. I think people are paying attention. And so if you pull back from that, which maybe you're right, some brands will try, they might be surprised at the backlash. They might kind of see that it's actually not worth the price. It'll cost them more money in the end, because I could see now in the world today, again, maybe being too optimistic and thinking that consumers will take note of that kind of thing. So I don't know. I think anyone who tries to take that step, which they might find that people are actually paying attention. Maybe not. I don't know. Maybe, we have short-term memory and everything just goes out the back door, but I guess we'll see.
No, but I agree with you actually, Dan. And I agree with your point when it comes to consumers having to spend money in their wallet that is in line with their values. Like maybe those things will take a step back. Like maybe they're not buying the sustainable products that are more expensive. Maybe they're not buying some of those other things. But when it comes to listening to podcasts and having an opinion and being vocal, it doesn't actually cost them anything when it comes to like hard monetary commitments. But I do think that they still will be vocal about it because they do really care, many of them. And I think it's easier to stand behind that if it doesn't cost you anything.
No, I think I agree too. Like it's easier for people to back that too. Like people will not practice what they preach really in terms of purchasing. Like they'll say, oh, we want brands to be sustainable. If you charge them an extra $1 on the product to make it sustainable,
then they may run away a little bit. But it doesn't
listening
cost
to a
them
podcast.
anything. Yeah.
I agree with a lot of this. I think the biggest thing, and someone like Stu would be an expert at digging into this, like being able, like we've had the opportunity to see brands just fund DEI and climate and like promotion and all that, like initiatives where their name isn't on it, but they're known for the association. It's like a softer association. I think we'll see a step back from that, and it'll be more like co-branding, right? Where the ad promotes the initiative, but says like at Cotopaxi, we do X, Y, and Z, right? Like really intertwining it as part of their marketing message so that their dollar still drives towards their acquisition and their goal, but it also shows their initiative. And I don't think that that's a bad thing. They can gladly have the credit for it. They don't have to be so soft-handed on it. I think for me on my end, I think when the price impacts me as a consumer, that's where it becomes difficult, right? When I went to the grocery store the other day and spent $5.50 for 3 giant green apples that weren't that great, and they were just like sustainably sourced, and I was just like, oh God, where can I get the not sustainably sourced ones? Like, there are things that I'm just gonna pause buying for a little bit, right? Like I agree with those morals, but there are places I buy that I'm not proud of. In the research that we just did as well, like there was a lot of people who were like, if a brand is associated with X, Y, and Z, would you boycott? And people were like, yeah. And I looked at that number and I was like, bullshit. Like, for all the things I talk about, all the positives and the goals that we have, sometimes we fall short, right? Sometimes it's the middle of the night and, I'll go to Walmart, which I tend not to shop at. But if I need something for my kid, I'm going to go there, right? Like there's specific things. So I don't know. I think that if the brands are if they start to ask for more, right, to compensate that additional cost that they now don't have the margin to handle, I think that'll be a backlash. But I really think that the brands that are just there and persistent and don't change their prices or whatnot and just make it more aware, it'll be good for them long term. I just wouldn't expect a lot of new ones, right? Like a lot of new foundations and organizations and focus on it. I think it'll become a backbeat of the industry.
I love that you guys are very positive, and I think that I wish that the world would behave as we wish them to. But I'm gonna dig in my heels. I'm gonna say, regardless of what I want, you want, what values we have and share. I think that the companies that fund the advertising and the companies that invest in programming are impacted downstream from the consumer at the store that says, I'm going to go off brand. I'm going to go with the one that doesn't make the large promise because I have less money in the bank than I did yesterday and I need to make economies. People vote with their pocketbooks. People make decisions on things that are valuable to them until it starts to become too expensive. And then you get into very primal motivations. So I think, in the types of advertisers you're going to see succeeding right now in the next year, I think you're seeing some of the direct-to-consumer brands winding down a little bit. If they were more of a luxury, you're going to see a rise in people that help you save money. And you didn't see a lot of savings tools advertising on these channels before. You're going to see a lot more of that. The luxuries are going to, some people will be able to afford them. Many are going to go by the wayside. And alongside with that, look, we don't have a lot of history on this going through cycles. When the Business Roundtable got together and said, we believe in stakeholder capitalism as opposed to shareholder capitalism, and everybody said it's purpose and then profit. Purpose is as important as profit. That didn't get tested against a recession. And so the good news that I think we would all be happy to see is that the ones that are serious are going to remain serious, and they've figured out a way to have a sustainable business that still advances the values that they purport to have. But the ones that were kind of cashing in on, what people wanted to hear from them, but weren't really serious about building it into their business model, I think that stuff's going to get blown away. And so there might be a reduction in the short term, but we will find out what's sustainable, and other people will grow out of the blueprints that are made by the companies that really baked it into their foundation. That's my point of view.
Well, yeah, no. And at the end of the day, it's not a binary decision either. And it's probably going to be somewhere that's a little bit closer to the middle. It's not going to be all the way to one side or the other. But I think there is, for sure. I think there's truth in all of what we're saying.
Totally. Dan's view is just a little bit more hedge.
I think it's right. It's a rock and a hard place, no matter what. I think brands are going to be in a rock and a hard place because people are going to they're going to want, I think what Bryan and I are saying, like you said, it's kind of bullshit how people respond to this stuff. They're going to want brands to keep doing this stuff, and they're going to say that they're going to want it. They're going to be mad when it stops, but they're not going to. But
at the same time, they're not necessarily going to reward it in a way that'll make it work.
Exactly. But they will give backlash. It's just, you're stuck.
Well,
also,
okay, so we solved the problem.
We solved the problem. All right. So now podcasts have impressions, and fraud is over, and we all know how to verify, and everything is brand safe. So thank you guys for doing this. This is
now we got to pick a new channel. We've beat podcasting. Give it to the next generation. What's next, Dan? After podcasting, what are we doing?
Have you heard about terrestrial radio?
There we go. Back to the radio stations. All podcasts 24/7.
A big thank you to James Cridland, Alyssa Meyers, and Bryan Barletta for providing invaluable insight, for pushing back, and for being great friends of Oxford Road. If you missed part 1 of this series, I would encourage you to go back to your thread and have a listen. As always, this show is dedicated to our mission of mobilizing marketers to advance truth and civility in journalism. We want you to not just know the news, but to use it for good. If you're a marketer looking to balance business objectives with your brand values, reach out to our agency, Oxford Road, by visiting oxfordroad.com and subscribing to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. Thank you to our guests and to Bianca, Kyle, Shayla, and the team at Podcast One. As always, influence responsibly.